A child's monitor blinked blue in the dark, and then the light went out like a breath held too long, as if the night itself forgot how to keep faith with the living. In the ICU, machines hiccuped, alarms held their tongues, and down in the humming belly of the hospital, a tremor passed through steel and wire, like a shiver in an old spine. Someone had silenced a safeguard for profit and for pride, and the only person who noticed in time was the woman nobody saw at all, the one pushing a rattling cart with a mop that sang to linoleum. She had a name and a mother sleeping 2 floors up, and she had a memory that didn't let go of numbers or broken promises. If you're here tonight, you're about to hear how a cleaner saved a hospital. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. May Carter had learned to move through corridors like rain, calm, steady, and impossible to stop without making a mess somewhere else. 57 years had taught her the rhythm of breathing with machines, the smell of lemon disinfectant settling on tile, the slight metallic taste that hangs over a ward when fear is awake, and the way people look through a woman when she is pushing a cart instead of a briefcase. She took the late shift because the late shift left the day for her mother, for spooning oatmeal and singing old hymns to soothe the woman who once ironed May's school uniform and taught her to pin a hem without pricking her patience. The badge clipped to May's collar said Environmental Services, but back in a different life, it might have said Pharmacy Tech, Safety Training Certified, quick on the draw with dosage math and cross-checks. She had given up tests and certificates for the long, slow work of keeping a promise, and so the hospital learned to treat her like a shadow that cleaned up other people's footprints. In the elevator, young doctors tapped at their phones and said "sweetheart" without looking up, but May counted floors and remembered names even when those names would not remember hers. She was small and made smaller by the way some men like to shorten women to pet names and problems to budgets. Still, her eyes were steady, and they took in every sign taped crooked and every seal cut neat. Because once you've watched a loved one forget the day of the week, you learn to hold tight to every clue that time leaves behind. Victor Langley wore authority like a suit that had been pressed by someone else's care. He liked the feeling of nods turning into yeses before he finished his sentence, liked calling meetings where other men brought him coffee and women brought him numbers. He ran the hospital's operations as if efficiency were a moral code and appearances a sacred right. The quarterly report had become his confession and absolution, and the whispers about a new wing bearing a donor's name glowed on his horizon like a sunrise only he could see. Somewhere along the way he learned that a cut to payroll could be dressed up as innovation, that a cheaper contract could wear the mask of reform, that a delay in maintenance could be explained by a chart if the colors looked good. He had once told May he'd make sure her mother's coverage didn't skip a beat during a policy change, and when it did skip and stumble, he called it a systems error and watched the apology evaporate in the air-conditioned breeze of his office. He was a practiced man at the art of saying "we" when he meant you, and "they" when he meant the people who swept, wiped, lifted, and carried. He was a man who smiled at donors with both rows of teeth and smirked at staff with the corners of his mouth, a man who thought gratitude was a currency he could spend on other people's time. In rooms where glass walls made his command visible, he measured compliance and mistook it for respect. He liked to tell the night crew that lean operations meant everyone doing more with less, as if the phrase itself could lighten a heavy bag of waste. May remembered the first time Victor took credit for something that wasn't his to hold. A refrigerated delivery had come with a fine dusting of frost, and she knew from the way the cold sweat glazed the plastic that something inside had thawed and wept before the truck rolled through the loading bay. She flagged it, called the pharmacy window, and kept the trays in quarantine while a nurse in a hurry suggested just moving them along. Later, an email blasted to the department praised swift action in preventing a potential incident, thanking a manager by name for vigilance and coordination. No one spoke May's name, which was not new, but it hit a bone she had nursed since the day her mother asked why the street outside looked like the one they lived on when May was 12, why the calendar said a month that wasn't in her memory anymore. That day, May sat down hard and decided to walk away from shifts that offered the latter and into shifts that offered the chance to keep her mother's days stitched together like a quilt from familiar scraps. The little slights added up like lint in a pocket. the sweetheart tossed like a coin without value, the bag checks that always found their way to certain hands, the schedule changes that pushed the hardest rooms to the people who had the least say. She told herself that dignity could be folded and refolded without losing its shape, the way a clean sheet learns to lie smooth after corners are squared. She listened, she watched. She kept track of what the building whispered when the suits went home. On paper, Victor was the kind of leader who loved a pilot program and a ribbon cutting, but the paper didn't show the corridor at 2 a.m. when the trash carts squeaked and the vents breathed warm and old. He told May he'd review her transfer request to the high-risk cleaning team, the one that came with better gloves and hazard pay if she could be flexible, which turned into shifting her to the administrative floors where the sills collected dust and the lights never flickered. She said yes because no isn't always a safe word in certain rooms, and because the bills for her mother's care landed with the weight of obligations no one else was going to carry. Flexibility was just another way of saying bend and don't break, and May knew the difference between a bend that swings back and one that leaves a kink that never quite smooths out. Still, she carried a small spiral notebook in the pocket of her scrub jacket, the one with a corner softened by time and thumb. It held serial numbers in neat lines, dates of service, odd sounds described in words that caught the shape of a humming coil or a rattling valve, and names written with a precision she refused to abandon. She copied down invoice numbers from stickers that peeled at the edges, crossed over to check plaques on machines that were meant to protect the breath of people no one else could protect at 3 a.m. There are people who pray with their hands clasped, and there are people who pray by writing things down, and May's prayers took the shape of lists, each item a small light in a long hallway. Something about the back corridor beneath the ICU made her slow her steps on certain nights. There was a door there with a seal that should have sat flush, like a lip pressed tight, but someone had taken to replacing it too often and too sloppily for it to be routine. She ran her fingertips over the adhesive edge and felt the fray of a second attempt. The hum of the auxiliary generator in the sub-basement, a sound she had learned years ago when a safety instructor taught her how to tell when a pump was lying, had shifted pitch. Only a little, like a hymn sung a half-step flat, but May had an ear that caught half steps and held them to the light the way she held up a sheet before smoothing it on a bed. She thought about the contracted maintenance crew, men who showed up with uniforms too new and badges that said temporary a little too long. She thought about the email that praised compliance and the night the corridor camera wore a blindfold of static. Everyone said the building was old, and old buildings groaned, and old staff fretted. Everyone said that the new agreements would modernize everything as long as everyone trusted the process. But May did not trust processes that asked her to stop listening to her own senses, not when she walked these floors like a steward of breath and quiet. On her break, she sipped coffee from a paper cup and looked at her notebook, the dates and numbers lining up like a choir waiting to sing. When the storm warnings crawled across the news in the break room and the air grew thick as if even oxygen braced itself, May pressed her palm to the hallway wall and felt a tremor run through it. She didn't know the shape of the night ahead, but she knew it was coming for all the places where someone had said good enough and meant not safe. May moved like a metronome through the blue hours, each step measured, each breath a quiet tally of what the building said and what the people in charge pretended they could not hear. She wiped a counter and felt the tremor in the stainless steel before the eye could see it, a faint, insect buzz resonance that didn't belong to a healthy line. The night was a library of small sounds, the hush of vents, the slippered shuffle of a nurse on break, the complaint of a gurney wheel sworn to squeak about its burden. She held her mother's voice close the way some folks cradle a locket, hearing it tell her to mind the details that other people forget when they have a lot of importance stacked on their desks. She thought about the word invisible and how it never really meant unseen, so much as ignored, and how a person could build a life out of being overlooked if she learned to look at everything else twice. Tonight, the air swelled with a storm's promise, and in that swollen atmosphere May felt the tug of decision forming in her chest. She had trained herself to keep still like a pond at dawn, but still waters are not stone, they move beneath the surface with intent. She cleaned, she checked, she kept, she waited, and the waiting had the weight of a woman who knew that patience is not surrender, it is a fuse measured to the length of a necessary fire. Victor enjoyed the night in the way a director enjoys an empty stage before the audience returns, confident that the marks he laid down would guide the actors whether they knew it or not. He had cut 2 positions on the late shift and called it optimization, then handed a laminated card to the remaining staff that showed how to do more in less time, a flowchart that treated people like arrows and boxes. When the safety board asked about infection control, he smiled and said the protocols were airtight, while quietly shifting budget away from protective equipment to a public relations firm that promised better sentiment scores in the local press. He had a way of lowering his voice and raising his chin when anyone questioned him, the way someone does when they're used to winning by changing the rules mid-game. Once, when May suggested that Red Bag Waste needed a second check before transfer, he patted the air near her shoulder and said, "That's sweet, but let the clinicians handle the technical stuff. We don't need to overcomplicate the night." He called the night the skeleton crew, as if bones weren't the structure that keeps a body standing. Earlier that evening, he stopped by the ICU wing with a donor on his arm and talked about outcomes in a way that turned lives into bullet points, then made a note to remind maintenance to hide the peeling paint behind an art poster. He didn't see May, not really, just the shape of a uniform that meant the tables would shine for the morning tour. When he signed off on the latest maintenance invoice, he saw numbers that obeyed his goals and not a single serial stamp, and it seemed enough to be the man whose signature made other people's work look official. His certainty was a suit that didn't bend, and every time he straightened his cuff, the night shivered with the arrogance of unchecked comfort. Ethan had a tired face that belonged to someone too young to be that old, and a badge that still held the gloss of newness. He mouthed the policies, as if reciting would make them true, and told his girlfriend on the phone that it was just a stepping stone, that you don't get to pick your morals off the shelf the first year. He had been told to adjust a spreadsheet that tracked service intervals to match the invoice dates, not the work dates, and he told himself that invoices were work in a certain light, that the paper trail mattered more than the footprints in the dust near the generator room door. He printed an email because screens made him miss things, and then left the printout by a keyboard when the alarms in his head about doing the wrong thing were drowned by the actual alarm of a supervisor asking where he was on the report. He avoided May's eyes because they were steady and had that older person's clarity that makes younger people see themselves more sharply than they like. When the camera over Corridor B blinked out for 2 hours on the day a maintenance tag was changed, Ethan logged it as scheduled calibration because scheduled sounded safe. That night, he walked past May near the vending machines, nodded like a neighbor who doesn't want a conversation, and told himself that if anything were really wrong, someone with a title bigger than his would have done something by now. He liked to think of himself as good, as in kind, as in not the problem, and those self-descriptions were soft blankets he pulled over the parts of his job that kept catching on the edges of his conscience. He wondered, fleetingly, if the hum he heard last night was the same one he heard tonight, and then he silenced the wonder with the tap of a key. Lila had a tired face that knew how to bind the fear out of a room, and her eyes took stock with a nurse's appraisal, clear, quick, cutting to what mattered. On her rounds, she had felt the breath of the ICU stutter in that tiny way that only someone who listens for a living can hear, a hiccup in the cadence of beeps that map a night's geography. She didn't trust the new maintenance crew because she had asked one a simple question about the bypass procedure and watched his gaze slip sideways the way a fish does when it wants to avoid a hand. In the break room, she told May that the vents felt too warm for the set point and that twice this week the backup test hitched like a mule that didn't want to climb. May, quiet as always, nodded and filed the data in the place she kept things that mattered. Lila had a way of lowering the temperature in a conversation when someone tried to raise it, of making a truth sit on the table without apology. She told May to be careful because being right isn't always the same as being safe, especially when the people who don't want to hear you are the ones who sign the schedule. When the storm watch rolled across the screen, Lila checked the crash carts with a care that bordered on tenderness and made sure the manual ventilators were exactly where they were supposed to be, because when dependency fails, hands take over. She touched May's arm when they crossed paths and said, "If something feels off, call me first," and there was an understanding in that touch, an alliance that didn't need a meeting to make it official. The night tightened around them like a belt pulled one hole too far, and Lila started counting breaths the way she counted doses, as if numbers could keep the dark from taking liberties. There was a paper trail that looked correct at a distance and fell apart under a fingertip. The invoices listed replacements that did not exist in the inventory, and the stickers on the machine read like a stutter of dates that didn't add up to a rhythm any honest maintenance log would keep. Someone had learned to make the camera blink on the nights the work was allegedly done, and the person who learned that trick had also learned the habit of writing one name that could pass for another in a rush. The seal on the electrical cabinet had been peeled with care and sealed again with less care, as if the ritual mattered more than the sacrament. May traced these facts with the quiet obsession of a woman who knows that madness can be avoided if you keep making sense of what you can reach. She took photos with an old phone whose camera lens had a scratch, carefully angling to avoid blur, and wrote timestamps in her notebook because she did not trust the way systems can forget what the humans inside them wish would be remembered. She had filed an anonymous report once and read the response that said insufficient specifics, the words nestled in a template that looked apologetic without being sorry. After that, she started keeping duplicates, not because she wanted to bring the house down, but because she wanted the house to stop pretending termites were a myth. She knew what a bypass switch did in a training diagram and what it would enable if someone decided that a test should always pass because failure was bad for business. The lie wasn't the signature. The lie was the inch of tape laid wrong in the quiet hour when no one was supposed to look too closely. May looked closely. She always had. At the edges of the story, a rippling error repeated itself, and repetition is the liturgy of habit. Someone's habit was putting people at risk, and the liturgy of the night had begun to sing a warning. The thing about exploitation is that it dresses itself in everyday clothes. Victor called it resource alignment and told the evening staff that budget realities required teamwork, which meant the heaviest rooms and the most infectious bins went to the people least likely to push back. When gloves ran thin, he laughed lightly and said supply chain, then made a note to order branded stress balls for a staff wellness photo op. The cleaners learned to rinse out and hang their own aprons because replacements were always on back order. They learned to carry extra trash ties because the dispensers were always empty on the floors where executives took visitors on tours. A young aide asked for training on the new disinfectant and received a link to a video that wouldn't play on the hospital computer because the browser was too old. The supervisor shrugged and said, "Just use more, like an extra scoop will fix chemistry." May watched people get smaller when they asked for what they needed and kept being told the need itself was inconvenient. She watched the schedule sigh and stretch around the absences caused by injuries that were called incidents, as if language could soften pain. She watched the way staff of a certain hue got certain hallways more often, hallways that made backs ache and lungs burn slowly, and she watched how the night taught them not to say it aloud, because saying things aloud changes your fortunes in places where discretion is mistaken for loyalty. The bargain was unspoken: accept the shape you are given, or risk losing the little stability you have. May held the bargain in one hand and her mother's bills in the other, and did what women like her have always done in the cut between principle and necessity. She kept walking forward, and she kept taking notes. What they didn't count on was how quickly necessity can turn into a reason to resist when it is someone you love breathing under a system that wheezes. The hope arrived like morning light under a shade, not enough to brighten the room, but enough to promise that brightness still existed. May had sent the anonymous report through the proper portal and imagined a cautious response, a quiet audit, a checklist day with clipboards and serious nods. What she got back was a form letter that asked for more details while ignoring the details attached, a tidy refusal wrapped in the language of procedure. She walked home that morning with the weight of it balancing the weight of her bag, and she decided to try it the way people in her family always had, by looking someone in the eye and asking them to do right. She asked for time with Victor, and he gave her 5 minutes that turned into 3, and called her concerns outside scope while he checked his watch. He warned her not to overstep, to keep the chain of command, to remember roles, and the way he said roles sounded like railings in a stairwell designed to keep you from climbing too high. He told her she was making trouble out of normal variance, and she smiled in the way that keeps teeth from showing, because teeth can look like threat. She left with a receipt for her conscience and a renewed knowledge that the people who most need proof are the ones who least want to see it. That evening, Lila found her in the corridor and squeezed her shoulder, and the pressure said, "I believe you." Ethan drifted past later, a satellite caught in gravity he didn't recognize, and in the brief moment their eyes met, May saw a boy trying not to drown in a shallow pool. Hope lingered because someone else could hear the wrong note, and disappointment settled in beside it because the conductor refused to admit the orchestra was off. Victor's mistake didn't look like a mistake at first. It looked like a victory lap around a lobby newly dressed in banners celebrating a partnership with a regional contractor whose logo smeared itself across a brochure like a smile. He shook hands and said resilient infrastructure, as if the phrase could lay bricks and solder wires, and in the press of congratulations, he flashed a laminated pass stuck behind his ID for a guest technician who should not have been anywhere near a sign-off. He kept talking and kept winning, and kept missing the small, bloodless details that make a system live or die. He moved through the hospital that evening with the careless ease of a man certain the deck angles to his favor. He sent the night crew a message about staying vigilant during the storm, and then turned off his phone to enjoy canapés at a fundraiser, and the message read, like a man telling other people to hold the rope while he took a picture with the mountain in the background. He had tuned himself to applaud outcomes and had lost the ear for inputs. He didn't hear the off hum, didn't smell the trace of hot wiring that smells like pennies and dust, didn't see the jitter at the edge of a monitor that says, "Pay attention." His overconfidence was a blanket thrown over a set of facts, trying to stand up in the dark, and when he pulled it snug around his shoulders, the facts found other ways to be seen. Somewhere, a switch waited in the wrong position because a test had to pass, and the pass had to be documented, and documentation had become a virtue divorced from truth. Victor smiled into a camera that loved his angles and did not know that the other cameras in his house were starting to catch his bad side. The storm rattled the city like a hand on a door that wouldn't open. Streetlights blinked with the uncertainty of a blink that remembers its purpose too late. Rain walked sideways down the glass, and the first crack of thunder broke over the roof like dropped dishes in a quiet kitchen. In the ICU, monitors thought about it and then thought about it again, hesitating in a way no one wants a machine to hesitate. Lila felt the room lean toward her as if asking for reassurance, and gave it by moving faster but softer, touching shoulders and checking lines and telling a man with fright in his eyes that storms make a lot of noise and noise is not harm. Down below, where the building keeps its secrets, the generator coughed in a way that made May's spine go straight. She didn't bother to explain to herself why. The body knows certain truths without permission. She made for the back corridor and felt her shoes slip an inch on a wet tile someone hadn't thought to mark, and she steadied herself with a hand on the wall that buzzed like an angry phone. There are moments when life announces itself as a narrow door, and the trick is not to argue with the frame. May's breath shortened into a steady drum, and she found that place in her chest where decisions line up and wait to be chosen. The night was a test, and not the kind you fill out with a pencil, and not the kind that forgives erasures. She thought of her mother's mouth making the shape of her name without sound, and she thought of a man who had called her sweetheart as if the sweetness belonged to him. The building took a long inhale, the lights flinched, and somewhere above them a child's monitor found that its blue was a thin thing under thunder. Silence crowded into the spaces where questions should have been asked. The mid-level supervisor on call texted a group chat and then texted again, the text stacking like bricks that make a wall around action. Ethan looked at the panel lights and told himself this was within variance, that a blip was a blip, that the worst thing to do was overreact. Lila heard the alarms try to start and then reconsider and felt her throat tighten with the knowledge that reconsideration was death's favorite game. May turned toward the sub-basement hatch and found the access key in the pocket where she kept the pen that had never failed her. The corridor camera glowed its little red eye and then blinked to black, not for the first time and not by accident. People who should have known better told themselves the system was robust, and that robust is another word for invincible, and they told themselves this because telling it kept their hearts from racing too fast. The building waited, and waiting can be complicit when it stretches past necessary caution. Lila's hand found her radio and her voice found a command tone that erased the part of her that wished she didn't have to be the one to speak. May looked down at the scuffed toes of her shoes and the cracked place in the sole where a drop of rain had found a home, and she felt the simple, blazing clarity that comes when you stand exactly where your life demands you stand. She wasn't going to debate a storm with a man who wasn't in the room. She wasn't going to ask permission from a system that had already told her she was not the right person to notice. The night had made its choice. She made hers. May pulled the sub-basement door and felt the damp breath of the building wash over her cheeks, the scent of oil and old heat and rain finding its way through the stone. She opened her notebook to a page where the serial numbers for the backup unit sat like coordinates to a truth, then bent to the small plastic seal that had been smoothed with a thumbnail, not her own. Her pen tapped once against the margin, a drumbeat of thought, and then she slipped the pen behind her ear and cupped the housing with both hands, listening. The hum was wrong, not loud wrong, dishonest wrong. The bypass lever sat in the position a test sheet would prefer, not the position a night with thunder deserves. May called Lila and said, "I need you to have the ICU ready to handbag the fragile ones if the lights hiccup again," and Lila said, "Say when," and the way she said it braided fear and faith without letting either win. May inhaled, felt the old lessons unspool in muscle memory, and pictured the safety course classroom from years ago, the laminated diagrams, the instructor's patient finger pointing to switch positions, and warning labels. She didn't have a uniform for this part of herself anymore, but the knowledge had not agreed to be boxed up. Around her, the building creaked like a ship and the storm rapped again at the skin of the city. May wiped her palms on her scrub pants, bracketed the moment with a small prayer, and set her hands where they needed to be to tell the truth from the lie. Her fingers moved slow, because slow is how you go when the stakes are breath and not applause. She toggled the bypass off its convenient perch and let the automatic start logic breathe on its own, then waited through 3 heartbeats that felt like a century of quiet. The machine stalled, coughed, and then caught, the way a body remembers how to stand after a long illness. May watched the panel lights in their stern little row. The voltage rose to where the paper said it should be, not where a manipulated test had declared it was. She looked at the handwritten sticker on the inside panel, a patchwork of dates that should have told a story of care, and instead stumbled over itself like a liar correcting an earlier lie. She took a photo, then another, steadying the old phone on the edge of the frame, and spoke the numbers into a voice memo so her shaky hands would not betray memory later. Upstairs, the ICU monitors steadied into a rhythm the nurses could trust, and Lila's voice came back down the line like a warm hand, saying, "We're good for now. Go ahead, we're with you." May closed her eyes once, just long enough to let the fear flare and then pass, and in the afterglow of that small fire she found the clarity that made her move again. She tightened a loose coupling with a turn she had learned from a maintenance man decades ago, when he taught her that snug is not the same as strangled. She flicked the camera switch in the corridor back to on with a firm push, knowing the blink back to red would mean someone else's plan had been interrupted. The room settled, the hum corrected itself into an honest tone, and the building exhaled along with her, as if relieved to be allowed to do the work it was built to do. The footsteps came hot with indignation before the man did, and Victor's voice rolled ahead of him, filling the corridor like a foghorn. "What do you think you're doing?" he said, and the contempt in the question was the old kind, the kind that expects the answer to fold itself into silence. Ethan hovered behind him, trying to organize his face into something that wasn't fear, and failing. May stood small and steady, the way you stand when you've had to explain yourself to men like this, in rooms like this, and learned that posture says as much as words. She did not call him sir. She did not call him anything. She held up her notebook and then the phone and said, "I turned off a bypass that never should have been on. I started the unit the way it was designed to start, not the way a test sheet wanted it to look." The ICU stabilized. Victor laughed in the manner of a man who laughs to keep the walls from closing in, and said, "You're a cleaner, not an engineer, and you've just breached a secure system." He reached for the panel like a reflex, to put his hands on the world to force it back into the shape he preferred, and May stepped aside, because she had no intention of wrestling him for a lever. Ethan made a choking sound that wanted to be a word. Lila's voice on the radio said, "We have eyes on you downstairs," and that we pressed felt like a line drawn with chalk that would not be washed away by rain. May spoke again, calm, telling Victor that the camera was recording now, that she had the photos from before it went dark, that she had the invoice list and the serial list, and they did not agree. The corridor seemed to narrow until all that was left was a man's pride and a woman's proof, and pride blinked first. He reached for explanations, like a man snatching at napkins in a gust, and each one tore from his fingers in that invisible wind and fell sodden to the floor. "Those seals are replaced all the time," he said. "Routine variation," he said. "Scheduled vendor calibration requires different mode settings," he said. "Wearing the word requires like armor." Ethan said nothing, and then everything with a single stammered "I didn't know," and the sentence hung there, naked and small. Victor told May she'd overstepped, that consequences were a fact of adult life, that her actions had put patients at risk, and the absurdity of that last claim rang in the metal and the tile like a wrong note struck hard and repeated. May didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. She said a child upstairs almost lost light because someone decided a fake pass was better than a failed test. She said a woman on the second floor would have lost her breath because the unit couldn't do what the paper claimed it could. She said her mother's name, and then she said her own, and the sound of those names together made the space feel owned by reality again. Victor tried to turn the camera off and found that it stayed red, an unblinking witness. He told Ethan to fetch the supervisor, and the word fetch said out loud what the work had been implying for months. Ethan didn't move. Lila spoke over the radio and said, "The deputy city inspector is on site for storm readiness, and she's headed your way now," and that sentence turned Victor's complexion the color of a man who just realized he has been playing cards in a room with mirrors. May's life had been quiet about its credentials because life had made other demands, but quiet does not mean absent. Once upon a younger time, she had studied for hours after shifts, learned how machines keep medicine honest, passed safety modules with the ease of someone who cares enough not to guess. She hadn't finished the degree she'd wanted because her mother's world had begun to slip. She'd taken the shorter road to a certificate that still mattered, and then she'd walked away from the ladder that certificate could have been. The knowing stayed, a stubborn houseguest that refused to leave even when the room rearranged itself. And because May understood that silence can be a strategy and not a surrender, she had used the phone number pinned to the community board near the chapel. The one that promised a local newsroom still answered calls at odd hours. The young woman who picked up had a voice May recognized without needing the name. It was her daughter's friend from school, now a reporter who had once eaten cornbread at May's kitchen table, who remembered how May tucked a napkin under her chin with the same care she tucked blankets around a sick child. May didn't traffic in drama. She trafficked in facts. She delivered them like parcels, each wrapped, labeled, and ready to open in the right order. The reporter had said, "I'm on my way," and then she had called the city inspector on duty, a woman who kept her boots by the door for nights exactly like this. May had not needed to shout to be heard. She had needed only to speak to someone who listened. When the inspector arrived, she didn't lead with apologies for the inconvenience of her presence. She led with a badge and a flashlight, and a practiced eye that made the room shift its posture. Lila flanked May the way a guard flanks a queen when the board has turned and the game is no longer the one it was supposed to be. The inspector listened to May's account without trimming it, then turned to Victor and asked him to demonstrate the proper test sequence. He faltered, because the language he spoke most fluently was budget and blame, and the language the moment required was procedure and principle. Ethan found himself betraying the man who had taught him to betray himself, and he pointed to the logs, then the video gaps, then the sticker that didn't match the register. He said, "We documented a pass on a night the camera was down and the technician of record was off-site, and the words sounded like a confession because they were one." The inspector nodded, stepped to the panel, and asked May to show her exactly what she had done. May did, without embellishment, and the hum that followed was the hum a machine makes when it has been told it is allowed to be honest. Upstairs, Lila confirmed stability, and the reporter captured the moment in the rough light of a phone that didn't care about angles, only truth. The recording wasn't pretty, it didn't need to be, it needed to be plain. You could hear the thunder underline each sentence, a punctuation the weather offered as if it had taken a side. The data unfurled with the brutal grace of a flag in a hard wind. There were gaps where there should have been lines. There were names where there should have been signatures. There were times recorded that belonged to people not present. The inspector called for a seal on the room, for a hold on the vendor's next invoice, for a copy of the camera downtime report, and in the wake of those orders, the hospital's heartbeat found a steadier rhythm. Victor's face went pale around the mouth the way milk turns when it's left out too long. He spluttered that this was an attempt to make him a villain for doing his job under difficult constraints, and the word villain sat in the air like a moth drawn to a porch light. He started to say that lives had not been lost, as if that were the bar, as if harm must finish its arc to be counted. The inspector cut him off with a soft, "No, sir," and in that no lived the weight of 1,000 bare minimums that once passed for acceptable. May said nothing more, because she had said enough, and because victory in rooms like this is held with restraint. The generator's corrected hum felt like someone clearing a throat after a lie has been told too long, a promise to speak clearly from now on, if allowed. Upstairs, applause doesn't usually belong to nights like this, but the human body has its own ideas about where gratitude should go. Nurses clapped because hands that don't stop working need a way to express relief beyond breath and motion. The respiratory tech who had prepared manual bags leaned against a wall and cried, quick and small, where no one could see unless they knew where to look. Ethan found May in the corridor and said, "I'm sorry," and the words didn't try to do more than they could do. They didn't ask forgiveness to be easy. He told the inspector what had been asked of him and what he had done, and then he told her what he was willing to testify to now. Lila hugged May, a quick squeeze, then turned to adjust a drip with a competence that made the hug feel like part of the protocol rather than an indulgence. Staff, who had felt the burden of schedules and shortages, stepped into the light of the moment to say, "Yes, that happened, and yes, we saw, and yes, we were scared to speak." Fear turned its coat and stood for a moment on the right side of the room, shocked at the view. The applause died quickly because work does not pause long in such places, but the echo of it clung to the ceiling tiles and refused to be washed away by habit. Out of the elevator came a woman with winter in her hair and steel in her step, the chair of the hospital board who had learned long ago the difference between leadership and management. She didn't waste the walk on pleasantries. Her eyes found May with the quickness of someone remembering a kindness she once received in a fevered dawn, a warm blanket and a cup of water placed by hands that expected no credit and no thanks. She said May's name out loud in a tone that turned it into acknowledgement, and then she turned to the inspector, the reporter, and finally to Victor. In public and without theatrics, she announced an independent audit and an immediate administrative leave for the man whose signature had been mistaken for evidence of virtue. Victor started to say this was premature, and she said the word premature like a diagnosis that could be fatal if not treated. She thanked May in front of everyone and then thanked the night staff as a whole, naming the department that everyone forgets first and remembers last, Environmental Services, and the name rang true in a way that made some people look at their shoes. She did not, in that moment, become a savior. She became what she was supposed to be, and that was enough to change the weather in the room. The reporter lowered her phone, meeting May's eyes with a smile that belonged to kitchens and not to newsrooms, and the inspector wrote one last note and then shook May's hand. The night, having nearly been turned into a story with a different ending, settled back into itself with a sigh. The twist in the tale was not lightning or some deus ex machina dropping from the rafters. It was legacy, which is to say, the slow accrual of characters' interest paid back at the moment it is most needed. The board chair remembered the anonymous woman who had noticed a detail the night her own husband's IV pump had blinked a warning too soft for tired eyes. She had asked a nurse about it, and the nurse had said, "May caught that, she catches everything," and then the night had moved on, because nights do. That memory had sat on a shelf in her mind gathering dust until this storm brushed it clean. And while men who prefer the shape of control often imagine revolutions as loud and dramatic, the ones that work in hospitals tend to come dressed in policy and procedure and the reallocation of money away from lights and toward lungs. Lila, who had already begun drafting an email in her head about crisis protocols, found herself speaking to the board chair about the way equipment testing gets scheduled, and the board chair listened the way a woman listens when she knows every ignored sentence will cost twice later. Ethan, having found the part of himself that wanted to keep his future and his integrity in the same room, texted the reporter the email he'd printed and then sent it to the inspector as well. May did not bask. She walked down a quiet hallway toward the ward where her mother slept and paused at the window, watching the old woman's chest rise and fall under light that now hummed like a promise kept. The night had been saved by a cleaner because the cleaner had always been a keeper of lists, of vows, of the exact pitch of a machine that means to be honest. And in the story's marrow, the underdog did not become a different person to win, she simply became impossible to ignore. Victor's leave was immediate and public, but the aftermath was designed to teach, not simply to punish, because harm in a hospital must be mended in the same place it was made. The board chair signed an order for a full safety audit that would read every panel and policy out loud to the people who depended on them, and the inspector's seal held the generator room like a stern hand on a shoulder that had shrugged too much for too long. The contractor's agreement was frozen, invoices pulled, the paper trail marched into daylight, and the gaps were treated as symptoms that required treatment, not excuses that required spin. Every leader who had signed the word compliance learned to say accountability instead, and there were required classes with no back row, courses that named bias and taught the difference between listening and waiting to speak. The night staff received new gloves that did not rip, and aprons that did not fray. The red bag waste path was redrawn to match science instead of convenience. A protected hotline was posted in every break room with a promise that anonymity would mean shield and not silence, and that promise was written in the sort of language that could not be massaged into meaning nothing. Policies were rewritten to require recorded tests with independent witnesses, and the schedule learned to honor the backs that bore it. In a small ceremony without microphones, the board chair looked at the people who clean and lift and haul and said their department name until the room understood it housed the lungs of the building. Victor, for his part, sat across from a panel and heard the truth he had trained himself not to hear, and in the hearing found the first crack through which change might grow, not as absolution, but as assignment. May did not wake up a different person the next day. She woke up the same woman with a new kind of key in her hand. The hospital offered her a position as night safety coordinator, a role built for exactly the way she pays attention, with training that recognized her old knowledge as foundation instead of footnote. She sat in a classroom where the instructor asked questions she had longed to hear, asked out loud, and she answered with the steady voice of someone who has carried breath through storms. They offered tuition support to complete the credential she had set aside all those years ago, and she accepted, not to prove anything to people who had never learned her name, but to honor the girl she once was and the mother she had become. On her first evening wearing a badge with her full name printed clean and large, she walked the corridor toward the ward where her mother rested and felt the lights hum in tune, the panels sing the honest note, the air move like it trusted itself again. She sat at her mother's bedside and told her, softly, that the night had been hard but it had bent in the right direction, that the building had learned to speak plainly, that hands had found their proper jobs. Her mother's eyes fluttered in a way that might have been recognition or simply a dream adjusting itself, and May laid her palm over that hand she knew better than her own. Lila stopped by after rounds to share a smile and a cup of tea and paper, and they talked about small things because small things are the texture of peace. A young tech paused in the doorway to thank May for making it easier to do the right thing, and May nodded, accepting thanks the way she accepted sunrise, as a daily blessing, never to be hoarded, always to be spread thin, and even over the hours ahead. There is a way to end a story without shutting its door, and that is how this one chose to rest. To those watching, the lesson walked in on 2 feet and wore a uniform that used to move unseen, the dignity of work, the necessity of respect, the power of quiet knowledge to unmask loud negligence. If this story touched a place in you where an underdog still stands up, even when the room says sit down, leave a piece of your own road in the comments, the part where you chose to tell the truth and what it cost and what it gave back, so others can meet you there and answer. If you want more stories where the overlooked become undeniable and hope arrives wearing ordinary clothes, subscribe now so you won't miss the next night when a small light refuses to be put out. And if you're ready to keep traveling with us, tap the next video on your screen and stay a while. There's another story warming up that wants to leave you steadier than it found you. Drop a comment 57 if you believe a mother's quiet courage can power a city through the darkest night. 57 years carried May to this moment, and tonight we honor that strength.